General Kale stood before the Imperial High Council, his metal-strewn uniform a relic from a war nobody wanted to remember. They addressed him with a mixture of ceremony and contempt. He warned them in steady, unwavering words, Earth was not like any other conquest. He had seen human warriors in the flesh, faced them when he commanded the 13th Shock Legion on Garrus IV. He remembered their eyes, not just fierce, but almost amused, even when outnumbered, even when their defeat was certain. The counselors shifted, some stifling smiles, others already checking their data slates. Kale pressed on, his voice ringing in the cold marble chamber. He spoke of the ambush at the River of Knives, of how a human squad vanished under fire, only to reappear hours later behind Imperial lines, grinning as they delivered supplies to their own. He spoke of the siege of Nadarin, how a human lieutenant bluffed an entire battalion into surrender, then shared their rations as if it were a game. He told them the worst part wasn't the fighting. It was how, despite everything, the humans kept laughing, singing, helping wounded comrades and enemies alike. That relentless spirit had unnerved his best troops, spread whispers through the ranks that maybe, just maybe, the legends were true. Kale's words filled the vast council hall, but only a few bothered to listen. One counselor, young and eager for glory, asked why the Empire should fear an isolated, primitive world. Kale answered with memories no decoration could erase. Their ingenuity, their refusal to break, how they made weapons from scrap and victory from chaos. He described their resilience, how, even when blockaded, they found a way to send messages, to gather allies, to resist. He recalled the quiet dread he'd felt watching a single human outmaneuver a dropship with nothing but a rope and a flare, turning defeat into chaos and escape. He spoke not out of admiration, but as a survivor who knew the truth. Every plan he'd made, every certainty he'd clung to, had been broken by their unpredictable tenacity. A high-born admiral, encrusted with jewels, scoffed at the idea that such barbarians could threaten the might of 1,000 worlds. Another counselor cited the Empire's intelligence, old weapons, fractured alliances, a population divided by creed and color. Kale told them none of it mattered in war. The humans would find something new inside themselves. They would unite, and when they did, their enemies would pay in blood and shame. His voice dropped, almost pleading. He confessed the nightmares that followed him home, songs in a language he could never learn, echoing in the darkness. Faces of prisoners who'd saluted him before escaping with his own men, the sense that humanity's true weapon was not technology, but an idea that could not be silenced. The chamber fell silent for a moment, but only a moment. The council's leader declared the matter closed. The Empire would proceed. There was no threat Earth could pose that a fleet of dreadnoughts could not crush. Kale stood dismissed. He saluted not for them, but for the ghosts at his back, and left the chamber with dread in his heart. He was not a sentimental being, but something inside him broke as he watched the council issue orders for war, so clean, so precise, so certain. Kale's warning, the last echo of a nearly forgotten campaign, was filed away as a formality, an old veteran's rambling. He returned to his quarters, locked the door, and stared at the list of ships bound for Earth. The same cold certainty crept in. They had not listened. They had not understood. Across the Empire, fleets mobilized. Officers boasted in war rooms, strategists spun victory from numbers, and young recruits wrote home about glorious conquest. Kale watched, powerless, knowing what waited for them. He remembered the faces of human prisoners who had smiled as if sharing a secret joke with the universe. He remembered how, after the armistice, a human medic saved his life from poison meant for a traitor. He remembered, most of all, the day he realized that every alien who fought the humans returned changed, never quite able to explain why. Kale tried to send one final message, but it was intercepted. His access was revoked, his reputation quietly erased by those who feared his stories might sow doubt. The machine of war rolled on, heedless. In the days before the invasion, Kale found himself shunned by friends and colleagues. Even his family urged him to let go of the past, to accept the wisdom of the council, and enjoy his honors. He sat alone, clutching a tattered medallion, a human keepsake he'd found in the mud after Nadarin. He thought of the countless young officers about to learn what he already knew, the cost that would be paid in lives and pride. He wondered if any of them would listen when it mattered, if any would see the truth before it was too late. He drafted a journal, just in case, so that if he fell into disgrace, someone might one day read it and understand. When the invasion order was finally given, Cale did not attend the celebration. He watched from afar, seeing the gleam in the eyes of those who believed war was a matter of numbers and firepower. He whispered a warning to the void, to anyone who might hear, to the ghosts of old enemies who had become the measure of his own courage. They had ignored him. Now, the galaxy would see why that was a mistake no empire could afford to make twice. The Empire's fleets surged toward Earth, confident in their supremacy. Admirals broadcast messages of certain victory, soldiers rehearsed parade routes, and distant worlds awaited news of a swift campaign. The first landings were textbook, cities falling beneath orbital bombardment, resistance scattered. Initial reports were triumphant, enemy forces disorganized, defenses weak, territory seized within hours. Analysts predicted surrender by week's end. Then, the pattern shifted. Patrols began vanishing from secured zones. Supply convoys were attacked in broad daylight, roads blocked by debris or flooded by diverted rivers. What should have been safe territory became a maze of traps, confusion, and rumor. Imperial commanders issued harsher orders, convinced discipline alone would end this farce. But the humans fought on terms no algorithm could predict. They appeared where sensors were blind, struck at dusk, then disappeared into networks of tunnels and shadowed streets. Drones sent to follow were blinded by static. Communication relays failed. Hacked broadcasts taunted occupation forces with their own casualty figures. In the darkness, soldiers heard laughter, sometimes children's, sometimes their own, echoed back at them by devices hidden in the rubble. For every human captured, two more took their place, blending into the background, then striking when least expected. Stories filtered up the chain of command. A platoon cornered in a school was led to safety by local teachers who claimed not to know a word of the invaders' language. Tanks bogged down in fields, sabotaged by farmers who had never held a weapon before. Supply officers reported missing crates, only to find enemy uniforms abandoned neatly in their barracks as if returned out of politeness. In one region, a so-called defeated city rose up in synchronized chaos, overrunning a garrison during the night with makeshift weapons and nerves of steel. Commanders doubted the reports until their own intelligence corroborated them. Imperial morale wavered as human counterattacks grew bolder. Rookie soldiers lost their nerve, officers barked orders with hollow certainty, and veterans whispered of cursed terrain and unbreakable will. Some even began to envy the humans' unity. Despair crept into the ranks. Instead of glory, they found only paranoia, sleepless nights, and the constant knowledge that the next face in the crowd might be the last they ever saw. Official broadcasts labeled resistance as desperation, yet ground reports painted a different picture: coordination, intelligence, and ability to adapt so rapidly that every imperial advantage dissolved by dawn. Cale, confined to his quarters, followed the transmissions he could intercept. He recognized the familiar cycle: initial dominance, then a slow unraveling as the humans forced their enemy into unfamiliar ground. He heard the fear in the voices of field officers requesting reinforcements, the growing sense of futility behind every message. Some of his old subordinates discreetly contacted him for advice, no longer dismissive. He warned them, expect the unexpected. Trust no assumption. Respect the enemy, or pay dearly. Most were too proud or too afraid to heed him. The Empire sent in specialists, experts in psychological warfare, to shatter the humans' resolve. They failed spectacularly. Broadcasts meant to demoralize were twisted by the resistance into rallying cries. Fake surrender attempts lured entire battalions into traps. Propaganda posters vanished overnight, replaced by mocking artwork and jokes at the invaders' expense. When the Empire retaliated with harsh reprisals, entire regions went dark, refusing to cooperate, choosing silence over submission. The chain of command grew strained. Junior officers began to question their superiors' wisdom. Dissent, once unthinkable, crept through the ranks, fanned by the humiliation of failing to subdue an inferior species. Human adaptability became legendary. Engineers reprogrammed captured drones, children ferried supplies beneath the invaders' noses, and injured fighters returned to the front with homemade prosthetics and new tactics. Imperial medics reported treating wounded enemies who insisted on caring for their own, even in captivity. Human humor became a weapon. Songs, pranks, and graffiti mocked the occupiers, undermining their authority in ways no gun could match. Commanders banned any interaction with civilians, but too late. The infection of doubt had spread. Soldiers began to ask, if the Empire was so mighty, why did nothing go as planned? The campaign's costs mounted. Fleet commanders demanded more resources, citing sabotage and unrest. Logistics collapsed. Food supplies spoiled or vanished. Medical units were overwhelmed, not just by battle wounds but by a creeping despair that sapped the will to fight. The occupation force grew isolated, unable to trust local informants, sometimes unable even to trust each other. Reports of friendly fire rose. Some officers requested reassignment. Others simply went missing. The grand plan for conquest had turned into a daily struggle for survival, every victory fleeting, every gain temporary. Across the Empire's territory, news was carefully filtered. Civilian broadcasts claimed total victory, but messages leaked out, losses mounting, morale collapsing, the so-called barbarians, not just holding on but pushing back, evolving, learning. In the council chambers, blame shifted. Some accused each other of incompetence, others called for harsher tactics, still others, quietly, wondered if perhaps Cale's warnings deserved another look. In private, some whispered about him, the old general who had tried to tell them. Cale's words spread in shadowed halls and encrypted channels, a prophecy that grew more convincing with every setback. On Earth, resistance leaders shared intercepted transmissions with their fighters. They read aloud reports of imperial confusion and fear, turning enemy arrogance into fuel for their own resolve. Each victory, no matter how small, became a legend retold by every survivor. Children carried water to fighters. Elders organized escapes and ambushes. The line between soldier and civilian blurred, and the occupation force began to realize that the real war was not for territory, but for the will to resist. The humans would not break. They would not surrender. And with each day, more invaders began to understand why. The tide of war began to shift as stories of human defiance multiplied, spreading through both resistance cells and the ranks of the invaders. On the ground, the Imperial troops saw firsthand what Cale had tried to explain, a force that could not be measured in numbers or firepower. A squad sent to occupy a factory returned defeated, not by weapons but by workers who refused to abandon their posts, outsmarting their overseers, and then disappearing into hidden passageways. What began as fear evolved into an odd sense of respect. Some soldiers, assigned to root out civilian leaders, found themselves hesitating, doubting the orders handed down from faraway admirals. Among the occupation force, a junior officer named Liz found herself questioning everything she had been taught about the enemy. The prisoners brought before her, wounded, exhausted, some hardly more than children, refused to betray their own, protecting each other with a unity that defied all logic. Liz interrogated a captured resistance leader, and saw something in his eyes she could not forget, hope, undimmed by chains. When she reported her findings, she was chastised and threatened with demotion. Yet the questions gnawed at her. She watched her squadmates grow uneasy, their discipline fraying, their faith in victory replaced by anxiety and doubt. Whispers began to circulate. Some Imperial soldiers exchanged glances with prisoners, sharing bread in secret. The lines blurred, especially after one bombing raid left civilians and soldiers alike trapped beneath rubble. Rescue efforts on both sides joined, each unwilling to leave the other to die. Orders came down to punish fraternization, but enforcement proved impossible. Rumors flew of entire platoons refusing to execute captured fighters, of officers filing false reports to protect their subordinates. Commanders who once demanded obedience now struggled to maintain order in the face of mounting insubordination. Lys's crisis of loyalty deepened when her own superior ordered a strike against the hospital suspected of sheltering resistance fighters. She hesitated, recalling the human medic who had risked his life days earlier to save a wounded Imperial soldier. She refused the order, and though she was disciplined, the act inspired others. The word spread quietly, resistance not just among the humans but within the invaders' own ranks. Lys found allies in unexpected places: engineers who sabotaged equipment, medics who smuggled information, officers who stalled for time whenever possible. Kale, cut off from command but not from hope, used what contacts remained to leak critical intelligence to the resistance. He sent encrypted messages outlining Imperial plans, exposing weaknesses and helping the defenders anticipate each new tactic. Though his actions risked everything, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He saw what was unfolding, a transformation not only among the conquered, but within the conquerors themselves. For the first time, aliens under the Empire's banner began to question whether obedience was virtue or simply fear. News of Lys's defiance reached the resistance, who responded not with vengeance but with gratitude. Messages of support filtered back to Kale and the scattered defectors within the Empire's ranks. Human leaders made room for their new allies, offering protection and, where possible, mercy to those who chose conscience over command. The occupation force fractured. Some units fought harder, but others slowed, sabotaged, or outright refused orders, paralyzed by uncertainty. Small acts of kindness snowballed. An engineer quietly disabled targeting systems. A supply clerk funneled rations to hungry families. A medic ignored distinctions of uniform, treating all wounded with equal care. In towns and cities, alliances of necessity became friendships of choice. Humans and aliens found themselves united not just by opposition to the war, but by recognition of a deeper truth: hope is contagious. The old tales of human savagery collapsed under the evidence of daily courage, humor, and stubborn faith in each other. Lys and her circle of dissenters became a nucleus of quiet rebellion. Their refusal to carry out a massacre became legend, and their example spread far beyond their immediate command. Kale's warnings, once mocked, now circulated as wisdom. Even high command could not stop the undercurrent of defiance. Secretly, officers rode home to their families, questioning the war's purpose and the meaning of loyalty. Among the resistance, victories were celebrated not just as defeats of the invaders but as proof that even in darkness, decency could survive. Every act of compassion, every moment of shared risk, became a story retold by survivors. The resistance drew strength not only from human courage, but from the quiet solidarity of those who, once enemies, now dared to dream of something better. Imperial discipline crumbled. Deserters fled, some joining the resistance outright, others disappearing into the landscape. The command structure strained under the weight of constant doubt. Orders were questioned, objectives delayed or sabotaged. Lys and her allies, once hunted, now found themselves at the center of a movement that could not be suppressed by force. In their refusal, they discovered the power that had so terrified Kale's generation, a refusal to surrender, not just physically, but in spirit. Kale understood now why the elders of his world had once forbidden all contact with humans. It was not fear of defeat in battle, but fear of contagion, a hope so resilient it could not be conquered. As the campaign ground on, it was clear that the real war was no longer for territory, but for the future itself. The defiance had become an idea, one that even the Empire's might could not erase. The Empire's desperation became unmistakable as resistance hardened and insubordination rose within its own ranks. Orders grew more brutal, but every crackdown only strengthened the determination of the occupied. Human leaders refused surrender, rallying their people with stories of the fallen and promises of victory. Each failed assault, each abandoned plan, chipped away at the myth of Imperial invincibility. Even Imperial soldiers who once marched proudly now moved with caution, haunted by the knowledge that their own had begun to disappear, some defecting, others simply refusing to fight. Messages of mutiny slipped through encrypted channels, small units vanishing from their posts or turning their weapons on those who demanded obedience. In distant star systems, unrest simmered. News of the failed conquest, and the human resistance could not be contained. Cale's words, once buried, surfaced again and again in secret conversations and whispered doubts. His warnings became a touchstone for those who questioned the old order. Lys, emboldened by her acts of defiance, rallied more defectors, guiding them to the resistance, where alien and human stood side by side, united not by race but by purpose. Each new ally carried with them the seeds of rebellion, spreading them far beyond the war zone. Within the Empire's high command, panic took root. Rival factions blamed each other for failure, purges swept through officer corps, and long-buried resentments emerged. Decisions once made with certainty became mired in suspicion and paranoia. Resources ran thin, ships refused orders, and entire battalions melted away in the face of impossible odds. The Emperor's pronouncements fell flat, authority weakened by the plain fact that humans could not be broken. Spies reported uprisings in other sectors, unrest that echoed the contagion of hope first sown on Earth. Cale, imprisoned but not silenced, watched as the world changed beyond his cell. Messages reached him, smuggled in by defectors and sympathetic guards. They told of resistance leaders who credited him for their survival, of Lys now serving as a bridge between human and alien, of old enemies who now called him comrade. He listened to the distant thunder of battle and knew, at last, that he had been heard. His words, denied in council chambers, now lived in the actions of those who chose to defy. The final days of the occupation blurred into chaos. Imperial ships, unable to maintain control, lifted off in retreat under the cover of darkness. On the ground, joint patrols of humans and former invaders enforced fragile peace, worried but determined. Small towns rebuilt, laughter returned, and children told stories of the war in voices free from fear. The great armadas that once darkened the sky were gone, leaving only scars and memories, and the conviction that nothing would be the same. Across the galaxy, the legend of Earth's defiance spread, woven into the fabric of a dozen cultures. Worlds once cowed by the Empire's strength found courage in the example of the impossible victory. On distant colonies, workers and soldiers alike passed on Cale's warning as a promise and a challenge. The Empire's power waned, undermined by a resistance it could neither comprehend nor destroy. In exile, Cale wrote letters to those who had fought and survived, urging them to hold on to hope, to remember what had been won and at what cost. Lys and her companions became symbols of what was possible, unity forged in shared struggle, loyalty earned by choice, not command. Where once her orders had inspired only obedience, now her example inspired loyalty deeper than any rank could command. Human and alien families rebuilt together, old hatreds replaced by wary respect, then by something like friendship. The border between conqueror and conquered faded as the memory of resistance outlasted the memory of invasion. For the Empire, defeat was more than military. Its very foundation, fear and unquestioning obedience, had been broken. Unrest flared in world after world, sparked by stories from Earth. 1,000 small rebellions bloomed, fueled by hope that no power, no matter how great, could rule forever by force alone. Cale's warning, once dismissed, became a legend, retold wherever the Empire's shadow lingered. Time passed. On a quiet evening, Lys visited Cale, now a free man, bearing a message from the Resistance and a token of thanks, a piece of earth, wrapped in cloth, the soil of a world that refused to yield. Together they watched as a new dawn rose over a land scarred but alive, knowing the fight was not over, but that its outcome had changed everything. Across the stars, the lesson endured. The true power of humanity lay not in their weapons or their anger, but in the hope they inspired, the alliances they forged, and the courage to refuse what ought not be obeyed. From that day, no species dared provoke humanity lightly, not out of fear alone, but because they understood what the Empire learned too late. To war with humans was to risk awakening the same defiance in every heart the Empire sought to subdue. And that, Cale knew, was a legacy no conqueror could ever erase.